claimed the city and its surrounds to be a, quote, land of liberty, and while not a separatist from the Persian nation, this was in opposition to the Shah's government. His forces confirmed the state of Azadistan, or Liberty Land, on April 9th. By the 22nd, the Soviet Russians were on the move, and they were advancing on Georgia and Azerbaijan. Already with control of the Caspian Sea, the Soviets chose to attack Azerbaijan, and within a week they had swept through the country and seized Baku. On the same day, the 28th, the Bolsheviks handed over the territory to the communist puppet government. By May 1st, the Soviets had conquered Azerbaijan, and now had their firmest foothold yet in the southeastern Caucasus. With the Red Navy now able to base out of Baku, the non-communist Russian Republic's fleet, anchored at the British base at the Persian city of Enzali, was now under direct threat from communist attack, and the Soviets sunk the remaining Russian Republic vessels in a raid on May 18th, allowing Mirza Kuchak Khan and his factions to retake power, this time with Soviet-Russian support. As such, Mirza Kuchak Khan declared a socialist republic, with its capital in Rasht, and the intention to expand the revolution to all of Persia. However, Kuchak Khan was not really a communist, and while his grassroots Jengali fighters were appreciated by the Soviets, their allies in Rasht pushed for a coup against Kuchak Khan. On June 9th, the coup occurred, and the relatively moderate regime of Kuchak Khan was replaced by a hardline communist program set up by the more pro-Soviet members of the Rasht government. In July, the Red Army, trying to get in the good graces of the Azeris, prepared for an attack on Armenia with the intent to seize Nakhchivan for the Azerbaijanis. The Soviet troops delivered their reward to their new clients, and within a week handed over control to the local communists. The Azeris got the Zangezur Mountains in the middle, and for the time being, Soviet Nakhchivan was separate from Soviet Azerbaijan. On September 7th, the Shah sent loyal Cossacks, along with regional fighters loyal to his vassals, in an attempt to retake Tabriz. By the 13th, Tehran had reasserted control over Tabriz. Meanwhile, the Armenians were in the unenvious position of being enemies with both the Turks and the Soviets in their satellites. On November 28th, the Turks invaded from the west, and more genocidal killing of Armenian civilians began in one of the final phases of the Armenian genocide. The communists, certainly known for their own violent outbursts, exploded west to meet the Turks, and the Armenian government was forced to flee into exile. The Soviets had already installed the local Armenian communists in power, and were going to force them to play nice by now essentially posing as a triple agent, saying they would help the Armenians recover Nakhchivan, a promise that ended up unfulfilled as Lenin didn't support it. However, the Red Army field commanders were willing to tell their men whatever they needed to get them to fight for the Red cause. The Soviet Russians and the Turks did not engage in hostilities, and the situation remained largely the same by February of the next year. However, on the 11th, a Red Army force led by Joseph Stalin as political commissar invaded the future leader's homeland of Georgia. However, the Soviet Russians were just gearing up for the main assault, along with getting the Georgian Bolsheviks on their side, when major happenings in Persia took the spotlight in the region. By this point, Shah Ahmad was mainly a powerless figurehead, and the House of Qajar wielded very little real influence over the country. Regional clerics and nobles ruled much of the territory that the Shah purported to control, in addition to the swathes of territory, although now reduced, that he did not control. As of this point, that included not only Gilan, as we see on this map, but also several other areas of the country. In command of the Persian Cossack Brigade in Tabriz was Colonel Reza Pahlavi. The British managed to gain influence over Pahlavi, leading them to encourage him, with British logistical support, to march Cossacks to Tehran for potential action against the Shah. Pahlavi seized his opportunity, and his army surrounded Tehran. On the 21st, they entered the city. Only the police garrisons in the city center loyal to the Shah fought back, as very few were willing to spill blood for the Shah, who was seen as incompetent and spoiled. Pahlavi demanded that he be made Minister of War and that his ally in the parliament be named Prime Minister. The British now wanted Pahlavi to bring most of the country under his influence, including seizing back Gilan. The Soviets, seeing less and less potential in Gilan and Persia, now sent the Red Army, some of which was commanded by Stalin, to invade the rest of Georgia. Within 2 days, the Man of Steel had his homeland secured, and on the 25th transferred control to the local communists. the Soviets had to clean up their loose ends in Persia, signing a treaty of friendship on February 26th, which gave up any Soviet-Russian support for the Jengali communists in Gilan. On March 16th, the expected treaty between Turkey and Soviet Russia was signed, ending the now-and-again battles between them. Later in the year, the Treaty of Kars was signed between Turkey and the other Soviet republics in the region, formalizing their borders with Turkey. This included Soviet Nakhichevan coming under the control of Soviet Azerbaijan. Most of this policy was dictated from Moscow to the various Red factions, as they were essentially puppet states of Soviet Russia. The Azeris had to give back the Zangezur Mountains and some land to the east, while keeping both Nakhichevan and Nagorno-Karabakh. Nakhichevan didn't send a representative by order from Moscow, as was the Azerbaijani ceding of the Zangezur Mountains in areas to the east. With the agreement between Tehran and Moscow that the Soviets would not support Gilan, Reza Khan Pahlavi took an army to Rasht and invaded. Pahlavi was also rebuilding the Persian army, and without Soviet-Russian support, the Soviet Persians had no chance. By March of the next year, the Soviets no longer occupied their Caucasus puppet states. And for the first time in about 15 or 20 years, a relative peace came over the Southeast Caucasus. On the 12th, at the direction of Moscow, Soviet Georgia, Soviet Armenia, and Soviet Azerbaijan combined into the Soviet Transcaucasian Republic. However, this was just a precedent of consolidation for the December 30th signing of the Treaty on the Creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, colloquially, of course, known as the Soviet Union. This was effectively a new Russian empire on the northern border of Persia, and now a communist empire to boot, one that threatened the excesses of the Shah's lifestyle. In fact, the Pahlavi coup had not just rendered the Shah powerless, but Ahmad of Qajar was so scared he fled the country, taking a quote-unquote European tour. With the state now a kingdom without a king, Reza Khan Pahlavi continued his mission to stamp out separatism in the country. As Sheikh Khazal al-Kabi proclaimed his independence in October, Pahlavi planned to crush him with Persia's slowly increasing forces. On January 21st of the next year, Vladimir Lenin died, and this new Russian empire that Persia was just getting used to living next to became a big question mark. Stalin, now the general secretary of the Soviet Communists, made sure the question mark didn't last very long. On November 1st, the British began to doubt Pahlavi and began to consider that it might be better for Sheikh Khazal to conquer Tehran and re-establish Persia under his leadership. At the very least, they hoped to limit the power of Pahlavi within the country, for his power within Persia had increased rapidly following the Shah's departure, and Pahlavi, a dictator at this point, but a civilian nonetheless, began to have the styling His Serene Highness applied to his cabinet position. This, of course, is a style more generally applied to royals. Pahlavi made his case as much to the British as he did to his own people by crushing the Arabistan uprising, a few months later arresting Sheikh Khazal as he cruised on his yacht. On October 28th of that year, the exile of Shah Ahmad was made permanent, and the Qajar dynasty was officially stripped of the Persian throne. Now, instead of a kingdom without a king, it was a de facto republic. Even Reza Khan himself admitted that. However, nobody proclaimed the state a republic, and the British instead encouraged the election of Reza Khan as the new Shah. On December 12th, he was elected, and 3 days later officially began his rule, establishing the Pahlavi dynasty, dissolving the Qajar Sublime State and replacing it with the new Pahlavi Imperial State. On the morning of April 25th, the massive coronation ceremony for Reza Khan began. The ceremony marked the first change in Iranian dynasties in hundreds of years. However, the new Shah quickly began attempting to break his country off of the British and Soviet influence. In 1931, he revoked the exclusive rights for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to drill for oil in Iran. While he didn't nationalize the company, he did open up the oil industry to Persian companies. The Shah also dropped the revolutionary colors, although he kept the unique shape of the state's flag, and in late 1934 his foreign ministry requested that the English language name of his country be changed to Iran, Iran meaning land of the Aryans in Farsi. So on March 21st, 1935, the imperial state of Persia officially became the imperial state of Iran in all languages. However, within 5 years, the Second World War had kicked off in Europe. As of yet, none of the local countries were involved in the conflict. Persia continued its ties with Germany and nationalized some more British companies, although at this point the Shah held off on further messing with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. On June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union became involved in the war as Germany invaded, forcing the Soviets and the British to once again work together. This was turning into a movie that Iran had certainly seen before. On August 1st, the Shah received an offer from Germany to stay neutral in World War II in return for the most modern steelworks the Germans had. Reza Shah had heavily invested in the modernization of Iran as part of the legitimizing of his rule. Plus, the Shah didn't exactly need too much persuasion to stay neutral. On August 17th, the British and Soviets presented an ultimatum to the Shah to remove all German nationals from Iran. Iran had become a vital supply route to the Soviet Union. The British had a major presence in Iraq, although they no longer controlled the country outright, and had bases in the country which would have easily allowed them to supply the Soviet Union through Tabriz. Plus, if the British were able to secure use of all of Iran, they could then also use the network of roads from Tehran through Tabriz to reach the Soviet Union from that direction. On August 25th, the Soviets invaded the country from the north, while the British assaulted from the south. The next day, the Soviets captured Tabriz. The Soviets tightly controlled the flow of information in and out of their occupied territory, attempting to use propaganda to portray a glorious Soviet image, and in Tabriz specifically, create fertile grounds for separatism. By the 30th, the British and the Soviets had met up, and the two armies were bearing down on Tehran. Various Persian units began to surrender, including several top generals. When the Shah found out his military commander had surrendered to the British and Soviets, the Shah beat him over the head with a cane, and then nearly shot him until his son Mohammad Reza convinced him to back down and arrest the general instead. Meanwhile, the British and Soviets were getting acquainted with each other's equipment, as the advance halted for the moment while the negotiations continued. The Shah was attempting to negotiate the removal of Soviet and British troops from the country in return for complying with the ultimatum to expel German citizens and their families. However, the Shah instead secretly allowed Germans to flee the country, sneaking them out under the British and Soviets' noses instead of allowing the military to take stock of the Germans they were expelling. This enraged the Soviets and British, and on September 16th, the Soviets were preparing to further invade from the north. With the attack imminent, the Shah abdicated the throne, and wealthy residents, fearing the communist army and a potential Red Purge, fled the city. The virtually leaderless state was now powerless to resist. And on September 17th, the Soviets had the honor of taking Tehran. The British Army was also given a presence in the city, and a joint military parade was held to commemorate the victory. The British and Soviets also restored the imperial state of Iran, legalizing each of their occupations under the Shah's leadership, with the new Shah being named as Mohammad Reza of Pahlavi. The British had initially wanted to restore the House of Qajar to the throne. However, the Pahlavi crown prince was a young man, much more popular than his father in Tehran, and a much more practical choice. At 4:30 p.m., Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was crowned as the King of Kings. The British and Soviets quickly signed agreements with the young Shah to maintain their military occupations of his country until 6 months after the end of the war. The areas under martial law of each army were to be reduced mainly to the border regions on the north and south, thus leaving out Tehran. However, each country was still allowed to exercise a sphere of influence and station military personnel throughout their entire half of the country, with the Soviets getting the north, including Tehran. So while it wasn't included in the martial law area, Tehran was heavily occupied by Soviet troops during the war. May 8, 1945, the war ended in Europe. However, the war in the Asia-Pacific region continued, and thus the status quo in Iran remained. On July 6th, the leader of Soviet Azerbaijan, Mir Jafar Bagirov, received a memorandum from the Central Committee of the Communist Party, aka from Stalin and Company. Moscow ordered Baku to begin preparatory work for a national autonomous Azerbaijan district, and to also develop separatist movements for other regions of northern Iran with Azeri populations, while also trying to draw the Kurds of northwestern Iran into the separatist movement to form a national autonomous Kurdish district. To create combat groups for defending the Soviets and their allies in the separatist movements, and to create a social organization in Tabriz with branches in all regions of quote-unquote southern Azerbaijan and in Gilan. To establish an Azerbaijan Democratic Party with the objective of guiding this separatist movement. To publish a magazine and 3 newspapers for distribution in the new district. And to commit the resources of the State Publishing House and the Foreign Trade Office to enabling these publications. A week later, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, sent secret orders to its agents in and around Tabriz. As far as the Azerbaijani Democratic Party that had been called for, the NKVD recommended the transport of a certain Pishavari. They were, of course, talking about Saeed Jafar Pishavari. Pishavari was an ethnic Azeri from Iran. Back in 1921, when the NKVD's predecessor, the Cheka, staged a coup in Rasht against Mirza Kuchik Khan, the man they put in charge of the intelligence apparatus at that time was Jafar Pishavari. Because of this, he was arrested and imprisoned after Reza Shah Pahlavi had taken power. After 9 years in jail, he was released by the Soviet forces in 1941 when they invaded. Pishavari had recently run for parliament on the ticket of the pro-Soviet Tudeh party, and he remained a trusted Azeri agent of the Soviets within Iran in the fall of 1945. The NKVD also ordered the Azerbaijani Democratic Party to hold ostensibly open discussions for members of the Tudeh party on joining the Azerbaijan Democratic Party. However, the end result was predetermined, and all the Tudeh members in Tabriz were signed up for the separatist party, and to create local committees of this party not only in Tabriz but also in other major cities in northwestern Iran and the Caspian coast. To create organizing committees selecting from these supposedly authoritative democratic elements from the intelligentsia, middle-class merchants, landowners, and the clergy, but really this meant pro-Soviet elements. To use the resources provided by the Soviet state allocated in the previous document for the publication of the newspaper Voice of Azerbaijan out of Tabriz, and then go about organizing all of the agitation work via the press, in Gilan and in Kurdistan as well, although this wouldn't end up happening in Gilan. The NKVD ordered that the breakaway state adhere to the following dogmas, at least on paper, to attempt to gather popular support. A. Redistribution of state and royal lands, plus financial compensation for peasants. B. Employing the workforce through massive public works projects. C. Improving public utilities. D. Improving public health. E. Using at least half of taxes for local needs. F. Equal rights for minorities. And an end to the Shah's detribalization program, with schools and newspapers to be created using the local languages. And G. Court proceedings, including the gendarme and police activity in their local languages, plus using locals in the gendarme and police forces. On August 15, 1945, the Second World War ended, and immediately the Soviets began to organize local partisans and Tudeh members. Because Japan hadn't officially surrendered yet, the clock was not ticking on the 6-month deadline. However, the Soviets were getting prepared to act when that surrender did come. On September 2nd, the Japanese finally signed the surrender documents, starting the clock on the British and Soviets to evacuate Iran. However, the very next day, the Soviet agitation began. Jafar Pishavari formed the new Azerbaijan Democratic Party in Tabriz, with himself as secretary, and named Mohammad Beria as the head of the NKVD's new local Tabriz affiliate. No relation, by the way, to the head of the Soviet NKVD at this time, Lavrenti Beria. However, Beria's secret police had a similar terror streak in them. On October 1st, Beria organized the Azerbaijan Peasants' Militia in Tabriz, formed out of Azeri peasants from the surrounding areas. By that date, the British only had 5,000 men left in Iran, most of them in the capital, and those set to withdraw before the March 2nd deadline. Meanwhile, the Soviets still had their full occupation force in Iran. The British made this decision to pressure the Soviets and, quote, give them no excuse on that score. On October 21st, Bagirov sent the following update to Lavrenti Beria in Moscow. Bagirov reported that 21 experienced NKVD operatives had been selected to liquidate people and organizations interfering with the development of the separatist state. These 21 were now going to be ordered to arm partisan detachments formed out of the local peasants, To help with this, 75 NKVD spies in northern Iran were selected to help coerce their comrades into joining the separatist militia. All the workers will be trained in Baku and will be sent first to Tabriz and then to other sites within mostly the Azerbaijan area at this point. That is, after all, why Baku was running the show on setting this whole thing up. On November 17th, Azeri partisans in Tabriz began to disarm the Shah's gendarme units. The Shah requested to move in the regular army, but the Soviet army denied the request to let them move. The Soviet interference was actively allowing the revolution to take place in Tabriz, and 2 days later, Peshawari and Beria staged a coup against the Shah's authorities in the city. The next day, Peshawari declared a separatist state, the Azerbaijan People's Government. Peshawari was named the president, with Beria named the, quote, Minister of Culture, although again, despite not being the interior minister or the head of the secret police, that was his main job, and as the Minister of Culture, his job was to enforce the NKVD's goals. Peshawari, meanwhile, was the face of the regime, and the one who the Soviets constantly redirected the Shah's authorities to talk to on the matter. Peshawari named Azerbaijani as the official language of the state, and the use of the Persian Farsi language was banned. By December 14th, Peshawari and Beria's security forces had disarmed 6,000 of the Shah's troops and 3,000 gendarme units. With Kurdistan now an uncontrollable strip, it was ripe for the taking. And in the city of Mahabad on December 15th, the Kurdish People's Government was declared. The president was Qazi Mohammed. He was favored by the NKVD and been selected to lead the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran, the separatist organizing body set up in this part of northern Kurdistan. Thus, with the British mostly evacuated and left blowing in the wind, the Soviets still had their full occupation force, plus they had partitioned the northwestern part of Iran. In fact, Stalin and Bagirov had discussed merging Peshawari's republic into the Soviet Union under Bagirov's Azerbaijani SSR. However,